The Duskmarsh smelled like rain and rust, and the particular silence that comes after something terrible has stopped happening. Cale Morrow had learned to read that silence. 8 years as a deep-terrain scout for the Holtberg Reclamation Survey meant he'd walked into enough ruins, enough crash sites, enough places where civilization had tried and failed, to know the difference between emptiness and the kind of stillness that was only pretending to be empty. The Duskmarsh was the latter. Something lived here, or had been here, recently enough that the air still hadn't settled. He pulled his collar up against the gray drizzle and checked his mapping sensor for the 4th time. The anomaly ping had shown up at 400 that morning, 90 kilometers off his assigned survey grid. Not his problem, technically. His contract with the survey covered the Eastern Ridge system and the old terrace farms. He wasn't supposed to be out here at all. But the ping had been on a frequency he recognized. Civilian emergency beacon, alien band, the kind of compact distress unit that Vel'tharan diplomatic escorts carried. He'd been in the field long enough to know what happened when you ignored those pings. He'd also been in the field long enough to know what happened when you didn't. So he'd come. The beacon's signal grew stronger as he pushed through the sedge grass, its flat, wet blade slapping against his jacket sleeves. The Duskmarsh was technically neutral territory, one of the broad buffer zones between human-settled land and the Vel'tharan Pale, and it showed. The ground here was neither cultivated nor wild in any honest way. It was the land of things left behind, old boundary markers half sunk into the mud, a collapsed surveyor's station from 30 years ago, the overgrown husk of what had once been a shared water treatment relay. The gray sky pressed low over all of it, generous with water and stingy with light. The signal led him to the relay station, or what was left of it. The outer wall had come down on the eastern face, not structurally failed but struck. Cale crouched and studied the impact pattern in the collapsed concrete, not a weapon strike. Something had hit it at speed from the air, a small craft, from the radius and depth of the impression. He stood and followed the debris trail around the west side of the ruin. There, tucked into the shelter of the remaining wall with her knees pulled to her chest and one arm held stiffly at her side, was a young Vel'tharan woman. She was watching him with eyes the color of deep amber, nearly orange, with the thin vertical pupils that marked full Vel'tharan bloodlines. Her skin was the pale silver gray of brushed frost, not the bluer gray of the lowland Vel'tharan he'd traded with before, but something purer, almost luminous even in the flat, overcast light. Her hair was silver white, tangled with debris and mud, hanging loose around her shoulders. She wore what had clearly been an elegant set of traveling clothes, layered silks in deep indigo and gray, with the kind of subtle structural needlework along the collar and cuffs that wasn't decorative so much as communicative, if you knew how to read Vel'tharan textile rank. Cale didn't, not well enough to place her precisely, but he knew enough to know that whoever she was, she hadn't been dressed for a rough landing in a marsh. Her right arm was braced against her torso. She was doing a careful, controlled job of not showing pain, but he'd seen that posture before, the deliberate stillness of someone who'd learned that movement cost too much. She said nothing. Her amber eyes tracked him, steady and measuring. Cale held up both hands, palms out, the universal gesture he'd learned to lead with in the field. "I'm not armed," he said, in the standard trade Vel'tharan dialect he'd been using long enough to speak without translating in his head. "I picked up your beacon. I'm a survey scout, Holtberg Survey civilian. My name is Cale Morrow." A beat of silence. She studied him the way you studied a problem you hadn't decided whether to solve or walk away from. "You speak Vel'tharan," she said. Her voice was low and composed, the consonants of the high dialect, not the trade tongue. She'd switched registers to test him. He switched back, matching her register as best he could, poorly, but enough. Something shifted in her expression, not quite reassurance, but a recalibration. She looked at his hands, still raised, then at the patch on his jacket sleeve, then back at his face. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to decide he didn't have it. "My transport went down," she said, 18 hours ago. He lowered his hand slowly. "I can see that. Are you injured?" A pause so small he almost missed it. In Vel'tharan high culture, he remembered, admitting injury to a stranger was a form of vulnerability that had to be carefully navigated. There were forms and conditions, and he'd never learned them all. She looked down at her arm. "My shoulder," she said. "I think the joint is displaced." "Dislocated," he said. Vel'tharan anatomy is close enough to human for that to be the right word. He unslung his pack and crouched down to her level, keeping distance between them, moving slowly. "I have a medical kit. I can look at it if you want. No obligation." She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't call your beacon into a relay station," he said quietly, setting the pack down and unlatching it. "That's why I'm here and not a proper rescue team. Whoever you are, you chose a silent ping." He didn't make it a question or an accusation, just a fact he was laying on the table between them. Her amber eyes held something then, a wariness that went deeper than physical caution. He filed it and didn't push. "Yes," she said finally. "Okay." He found the medical scanner and extended it toward her, not touching, just visible. "I'm going to ask you to let me scan the shoulder. I'll tell you what I find and then you decide what you want to do. I have a portable joint reduction kit. I've used it before. I'll explain everything before I do anything, and if you tell me to stop, I stop. Does that work?" Another of those long, measuring silences. "Yes," she said again, different tone, less armor in it this time. Her name, she told him while he worked, was Saris. Just Saris. No second name, no clan suffix, no title, and she offered it with the particular quality of someone setting something down with care. He didn't press it. He told her his name again, spelled it out so she could hear the human syllables properly, and she repeated it back to him, once with the slightly different vowel weight of the Vel'tharan high dialect, which somehow made it sound more considered. The shoulder was dislocated, as she'd said. Not badly, a partial separation, probably from bracing against impact. He explained the reduction procedure step by step before he touched her, answered her questions about which structures would move and which would hold, and then, with her permission clearly spoken, completed it in under a minute. She made no sound during it. Afterward she breathed very carefully for a moment, and then she closed her eyes once, and when she opened them there was something different in them. A recognition that had nothing to do with familiarity. "You're good at that," she said. "I've done it a few times, mostly on myself." He strapped her arm gently into a temporary immobilizer and began cleaning the small lacerations on her forehead, debris cuts, all superficial. "How long have you been here?" "Since the landing. I sheltered here because the walls still stand on 3 sides. She watched his hands work with the disinfectant cloth. I was not certain who would come." "Smart to be careful," he said. "Duskmarsh is neutral territory, but it's not exactly watched." "No," a pause. "That was part of the reason I came this way." He didn't ask. He handed her the ration bar from his jacket pocket, dense, calorie-rich, human standard but not incompatible with Vel'tharan biochemistry. He knew that much, and when she hesitated, he said, "It's not poison, I promise. I've been eating them for 8 years and I'm still here." A sound from her, almost not a sound, the ghost of one, quickly contained, but he thought it might have been a laugh. "She ate. Hash part 2, 3 days in the marsh." He should have called it in. He knew that. The right procedure was to log the rescue contact at the nearest relay, update his position, request evac coordination for the injured party, and then wait. Standard protocol. The survey had clear rules about found persons in neutral territory. He'd read those rules carefully over 3 years ago, and he'd thought about them again that afternoon while Saris was asleep against the wall of the ruined relay station, her arm immobilized, her breathing finally even and deep. The trouble was that she'd chosen a silent beacon. She was alone in the marsh, clearly not by accident, and she'd survived 18 hours of Duskmarsh cold and wet with a dislocated shoulder without making a sound that would have reached any relay within 40 kilometers. Whatever she was hiding from, or hiding herself from, she'd gone to considerable effort. He'd been in the field long enough to know when someone needed saving, and when someone needed something more careful than that. So he'd set up camp in the ruins, built a contained heat element that wouldn't show on thermal scans from any reasonable altitude, and he'd let her sleep. He took stock while she slept. The ruined relay station gave them reasonable shelter on 3 sides. The standing walls blocked the prevailing wind, and the thermal element kept the ground temperature workable. The roof on the west section had survived the impact mostly intact, which meant they had cover from the rain. He inventoried his pack: 4 days of ration bars at his standard field rate, a water purifier, the medical kit, his terrain survey equipment, 2 emergency thermal blankets, a spare jacket, and the waterproof outer layer he was already wearing. Enough for 3 days with careful management, 4 at stretch. He folded the spare jacket and set it near her without touching, so she'd have it when she woke if the temperature dropped further. Then he sat with his back to the intact section of wall, 6 feet from where she was sleeping, and did what he always did when he had unexpected downtime in the field. He reviewed his terrain notes and thought about the sector he hadn't reached yet. He was good at waiting. He'd been good at it since the early field years, when he'd understood that impatience in surveying cost you more than time. It cost you accuracy, and inaccuracy in terrain mapping had a way of compounding into something that mattered months or years later to people who relied on his notes. You waited. You watched. You let the place tell you things at its own pace. He suspected the same principle applied to people. When she woke, 4 hours later, she found him sitting cross-legged 6 feet away with his back against the wall, eating his second ration bar and reviewing his terrain maps. She watched him for a moment before he looked up, and he caught the expression that crossed her face before she could settle it. Something startled, and then something that took longer to name. Something that looked strangely like relief. "You're still here," she said. "I told you I would be." He offered her his canteen. "How's the shoulder?" "Better." She accepted the canteen, drank, and handed it back. "Why haven't you filed a contact report?" He looked at her, she looked back. "Because you haven't asked me to," he said. She was quiet for a while after that, long enough that he returned to his maps and let the silence settle into something easier. The drizzle had stopped. The marsh made small sounds, water moving somewhere, a creature shuffling through the grass on the far side of the ruined wall, the distant creak of an old hinge somewhere above them shifting in the wind. "I need 3 days," she said. He looked up. 3 days without a trace. She met his eyes steadily. "After 3 days I can contact someone who will come for me, someone I trust, but not yet, not from a relay station, not through official channels." He turned that over. 3 days was not nothing. He was already off his grid. His survey contract had a clause for extended detour if he found something of recovery significance, but this pushed the edge of that. He looked at her. She wasn't frightened exactly. Fear in Vel'tharan body language usually showed in the jaw and the throat, a subtle tension he'd learned to read from years of trading negotiations in the Pale. What she showed instead was something that reminded him of the way certain animals looked at you in the field, alert, prepared, not resigned. She was making a calculated ask. She was doing it with complete awareness that he could say no. "All right," he said. She blinked just once, slightly too slow, just like that. "You need 3 days, and you need them to be quiet. I've got a survey contract that can cover a detour this far for 2 more days, and on the 3rd I can file a delayed position report that reads as equipment anomaly." He started folding his maps. "I know the Duskmarsh reasonably well. I know where the relay pings don't reach and where they do. If you want 3 quiet days, I can give you that." "Why?" she said. He thought about it. It wasn't a challenge, he thought. It was a genuine question. She was asking him to account for himself, the way someone would who'd learned that kindness usually had a price tag attached somewhere. "Because you clearly need them," he said, "and because you haven't done anything to make me think you shouldn't have them." A silence that was different from the ones before it. He'd gotten to know her silences already, in the few hours since he'd found her, and this one had a different quality, the kind that comes before someone stops being entirely alone with something. "3 days," she said. 3 days. He learned her by pieces, the way you learn everything real in the field, not through direct inquiry, but through what accumulates when two people share small spaces and small tasks. Saris could build a fire shelter with efficient economy. She'd been taught, he guessed, by someone practical, not ceremonially. She had strong opinions about terrain water sources that aligned almost exactly with his own. She moved through the marsh with a kind of attentive quiet that was different from stealth. It was more like she was listening to the place rather than hiding from it. She was curious about his work in a way that wasn't performative. On the second morning, she picked up his terrain scanner without asking permission, turned it over in her hands, and asked him to explain what the returning signal patterns meant. He explained. She asked a second question, and a third, and by the fourth he understood that this wasn't politeness. She was genuinely interested in the logic of it, the way signal delay mapped to topographic variation, the way two misaligned readings in the same sector told you something about subsurface geology that a single reading couldn't. He'd explained it to survey trainees before and usually lost them by the third question. She asked a sixth. "You like this," she said, at some point during the explanation. He paused. "Yes. I can hear it in how you talk about it. I've been doing it long enough that it stopped being work," he said. "I don't know exactly when that happened." She handed the scanner back to him. "When you stopped counting the hours," she said. He looked at her. "That's what she started again. "That's what I was told once, about the difference between learning a skill and possessing it. When you stop counting the hours, it's yours." "Who told you that?" A pause, the careful version of a pause. "Someone who knew what it was to possess something completely," she said. "And didn't elaborate." She never told him her full name. He didn't ask. But on the second evening, when they were eating around the heat element and the Duskmarsh had gone the dark blue of late dusk, she said, "My mother thinks I am somewhere safe." He waited. "She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm at the Eastern Diplomatic Residency." She looked at the heat element. "I left without telling her. I needed to see something, to understand something about myself, about what I want." A pause. "It was foolish to come this far alone." "But necessary," he said. She looked at him. "For you," he said, "if you needed to do it, it was necessary." He refilled her cup from the kettle. "What did you want to understand?" She thought about it for a long time. The marsh settled around them, dark and patient. "Whether I exist," she said, "apart from what I'm supposed to be." He looked at her. She was looking at the heat element with amber eyes that held the small orange light like a cupped flame, and her expression was not the composed, careful thing she usually showed him. It was something younger and truer. "Do you?" he asked. She looked up. "I don't know yet." "That's a good answer," he said. "That's the real one." She studied him. "You don't find that strange? A person who doesn't know if she exists apart from her obligations." "I find it familiar." He looked into his cup. "I spent 3 years doing exactly what I was trained for exactly the reasons I was told to, before I ended up out here. Took a long time before I started doing the job, because I actually believed in it." "What changed?" "I found a place nobody had logged before. Took me 2 days to survey it. And at the end of the second day, I was sitting on a ridge looking at it, just looking, not writing anything, not measuring anything, and I thought, I would have come here even if I wasn't being paid." He looked up at the dark sky. That was the day I started being a scout instead of just working as one. Saris was quiet for a while. I haven't found my ridge yet, she said. You're looking, he said. That's the first part. On the third day, she told him. Not all of it, but enough. He'd known, in the way you know things in the field when you stop needing the pieces to be spelled out, the quality of her silence, the way she carried herself even injured and in plain traveling clothes, the careful precision of her speech even in the moments when she let herself be unguarded. He'd known she was someone of consequence. He hadn't needed the details. But on the third morning she sat across from him with her hands around a cup of heated field ration tea and said, "My mother is the queen." He received this without expression. "The Vel'tharan sovereign," she said, "Vain Vel'thara." "Yes," he said. "I know who the Vel'tharan queen is." She looked at him with the particular wariness of someone expecting disruption, a backward step, a change in register, the small recalibrations that happen when the social landscape shifts unexpectedly. He didn't give her any of it. He refilled his own cup. "Her daughter," he said, "that makes you Selin Vel'thara." A pause. "Most humans call me the crown princess." "Saris is a better name for the marsh." He handed her the refilled cup. "Does it change anything about the 3 days?" She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "Good." He unfolded his terrain map. "Then let's talk about getting you to your contact point. Where are you trying to reach?" She'd been corresponding, she told him, with a trusted member of her mother's diplomatic staff, not through official channels, but through a secondary route she'd established over 2 years of careful groundwork. The contact point was a signal relay at the edge of the Pale, 40 kilometers northeast of their current position. If she could reach it and send a coded message, her contact would arrange a private extraction within hours, a small diplomatic transport, no state escort, no formal record. "The state escort is the problem," she said, tracing the route on his map with one finger. "Wherever I go officially, there are watchers, not my mother's people or not only. There are factions in the outer court that have interests in managing what I see and what I don't, where I go, who I speak to." Her finger paused on the map. "I've been trying for 2 years to go somewhere alone, to be somewhere alone, to see if I could." She stopped. "If you could think without someone else's thoughts in the room," he said. She looked at him. "I know that too," he said. The route would take most of the day. They walked it together, him carrying both packs, her shoulders still immobilized and her silk traveling clothes now irreversibly muddy and torn at the hem and more functional for it somehow. She navigated by terrain memory once she'd studied his map, retaining the route with a precision that was clearly trained. She knew how to read weather in a landscape she'd never walked. She knew which plants in the margin of the marsh were edible in Vel'tharan biochemistry and which were not. The marsh opened gradually as they moved northeast, the dense sedge grass thinning into wider flats with shorter growth and better visibility. The sky stayed overcast. He was beginning to think the Duskmarsh didn't know another kind, but the rain held off, and by mid-morning they'd reached the first of the natural ridgelines that divided the marsh's low ground from the higher terrain at the edge of the Pale. She climbed the ridge ahead of him because she could and she knew it, and he watched her from behind and understood something about the way she moved, the control of it, the precision, the way she always knew exactly where her body was relative to the ground. She'd been trained to carry herself like that. It was so thorough that it read as instinct, but it wasn't. He caught up at the ridge line, and they stood together looking out at the Pale. He'd seen the Vel'tharan Pale from the margin before, from the survey boundary, but always from the east. From the ridge above the Duskmarsh, it looked different, wider, older, the hills layered in graduated blues against the pale sky, the reed grass on the valley floor moving in slow patterns that were almost organized, like breathing. The air was different here, cleaner somehow, with a mineral quality he associated with volcanic stone. "My mother says the Pale has a smell," Saris said beside him. It does, he said. She says it smells like the beginning of something. She looked at the valley. I never knew what she meant until I'd been away from it for a while. Now you know, he said. She looked at him sideways. Now I know, a pause. She says a lot of things like that, things that don't mean anything until they do. Something warm and complicated in her voice. She's trying, I think. She just tries in the wrong register sometimes. The sovereign register when she means the mother register. That sounds hard for both of you, he said. Yes. She looked at the valley for another moment, then turned from it and started down the far side of the ridge, sure-footed. But she's trying. That matters. It does, he said, and followed. You're good at that, she said, without looking back. What? Saying the thing that makes the complicated thing simpler. She navigated around a root mass without slowing. Not simpler than it is, just the essential version. Survey training, he said. You learn to say what you mean because nobody has time for the other version. She made the almost sound again, the ghost laugh, the contained one. I have been in diplomatic training since I was 8 years old, she said. I have never once been told to say what I mean. How's that working out, he said. A pause. And then she did laugh, briefly and completely, the sound surprised out of her by the directness of it. It echoed slightly off the ridge stone and scattered. Terribly, she said. He was carrying both packs and the terrain scanner, and he was grinning at the back of her silver-white head as she navigated the ridge descent. And he thought, there's the ridge. There it is. They descended into the margin land at the pale's edge, where the Duskmarsh grass gave way to a shorter, stiffer variety that Cale recognized from the survey notes as native Vel'tharan border growth, managed, in a subtle ecological way that kept it low and open, useful for long visibility lines. She noticed him noticing. My mother's cartographers call it watch grass, she said. In the old language it has a different name, one that means the edge of what is known. That's a good name for a border plant, he said. She looked sidelong at him. You were taught survival skills, she said, or you taught yourself. Both. He picked his way around a waterlogged patch. You pick things up 8 years in the field, you were taught yours. My mother insisted, something warm and rueful in her voice. She said that if I was ever separated from my escort, which I was always expressly forbidden from doing, I should at least be able to keep myself alive for a week. Smart, he said. She is. A pause that carried the whole complicated weather system of that relationship in it. She'll have noticed by now that I'm not at the diplomatic residency. She'll have people looking. Will they find you before you reach the relay? Not if we're careful, she glanced at him. You're very good at careful. Survival skill, he said. She sounds like she knows what she's doing, your mother. Yes, Sarah said. There was a whole world in that single syllable, complicated and deep and clearly unfinished. She does. Part 3, the relay and the signal. They reached the relay station at the edge of the pale, with 2 hours of daylight left. It was nothing like the ruined station where he'd found her. This one was maintained, clean, surrounded by the precise low-growth perimeter maintenance that the Vel'tharan used in their border infrastructure. A small structure, mostly buried in the hillside, with just the relay dome visible above the grass. The kind of place you could walk past 3 times and not notice if you didn't know what to look for. Sarah stopped 50 meters out and studied it, the way he'd watched her study every piece of terrain they'd covered that day. He waited beside her. Clear, she said, no watchers. I'd agree. She looked at him. Are you going to ask me what happens now? No, he set down both packs. I figure you know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to face him fully, which she hadn't done in exactly this way before, not with the composed, careful face she wore in unguarded moments, but with something more open. She was a few centimeters shorter than him, and her amber eyes tilted up to meet his with an expression he'd been seeing glimpses of across 3 days, but hadn't wanted to name yet, because naming it would mean she was the Queen's daughter and he was a human survey scout, and the relay station was 15 meters away. "You didn't file a report," she said. "You gave me 3 days. You walked me 40 kilometers with a second pack." She paused. "You didn't treat me differently when I told you who I was." "You're still the same person you were before you told me," he said. Something shifted in her face. It was very small and very complete. "I know," she said. That is the point." He looked at her for a moment. The Vel'tharan Pale stretched away to the northeast, the low hills going blue in the afternoon light, the reed grass moving. He'd been here before, the edge of this territory, on the far perimeter of a survey zone. He knew this land. He didn't know this person, not more than 3 days' worth of wet grass and ration bars and carefully exchanged truths, but 3 days in the field had a particular weight to it, heavier than 3 months of ordinary time. You couldn't fake yourself in the field for 3 days. There wasn't room. "Send your message," he said. "Make sure you're safe." She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she went to the relay. He sat on the hillside with his back to her and watched the sky go gold while she worked the signal panel, giving her the privacy of her back. When she finished, she came and sat beside him, not across from him, which was a choice she made and which he noticed. 2 hours, she said, maybe 3. "I'll wait," he said. "You don't have to." "I know." She looked at the sky. He looked at the sky. The marsh behind them made its evening sounds, and the pale ahead made its evening sounds, and the two were different enough that the dividing line between them was almost audible. "Kale," she said. He looked at her. "I came out here to find out if I exist," she said. "Apart from my name, apart from what I'm supposed to be." She looked at the gold sky. I think I know the answer now, a beat, but I found it somewhere unexpected." "Where?" he said. She looked at him. Her amber eyes were very steady and very open, the vertical pupils wide in the lowering light. "In being known by someone who didn't need me to be anyone in particular," she said. He didn't say anything. He thought about his ridge. He thought about the day he'd stopped being a scout who worked and started being a scout who believed. He thought about how the two things were related in a way he hadn't had words for until just now. "That matters," he said. "Yes," she said, "it does." The transport came at dusk, small and dark and fast. A diplomatic bird that landed in the flat ground below the relay and sat with its lights low. 2 figures emerged, one of whom Saris recognized from her posture before she could have recognized the face. She stood up from the hillside and they went toward each other, not dramatically, but with the particular directness of people who'd been frightened for each other. Kale hung back. He'd packed both packs while the lights came down, force of habit. You were always ready to move in the field. He had Saris's emergency beacon in his jacket pocket, because she'd asked him to hold it when she'd gone into the relay station and hadn't asked for it back. He was trying to work out whether to call after her about it when she turned. She came back up the slope toward him, and behind her the diplomatic aide waited with the practiced patience of someone trained to be invisible. "Come with us," she said. "I have a survey contract," he said. "Your survey contract has a provision for administrative leave in cases of emergency assistance to foreign nationals." He looked at her. "I read the Holtberg survey's standard contract conditions last year," she said. "There's a version on record in the Vel'tharan diplomatic archive. My mother likes to know the terms people operate under." He thought about his mother's contract conditions being on record in a foreign sovereign's diplomatic archive and almost laughed. "To what end?" he said. "Where does this transport go?" "To my mother," she said, "who is going to have a great many questions for me, and who is going to, at some point, want to meet you." "Why?" She tilted her head very slightly, which he'd learned in 3 days was her version of a look. Because I have been missing for 3 days, and I was found and returned unharmed by a human survey scout who chose to do that instead of logging a contact report, and because she is my mother, and because she will want to know who you are. She held his gaze. And because I would like it if you came. He thought about his survey grid, 80 kilometers east, untouched and waiting. He thought about the provision in his contract. He thought about 3 days in the Duskmarsh, and the way a particular person had sounded saying, "I haven't found my ridge yet." He picked up both packs. "All right," he said. Part 4, the Queen's Court. The Vel'tharan seat of sovereignty was not a palace in any architectural tradition Kale had learned from books. It was a citadel, old, mountain stone, built into and out of a volcanic ridge that rose from the high pale plateau with the absolute authority of something that had been there before the people who built on it and would be there after. The stone was black, naturally black from the volcanic base, and the Vel'tharan architects over centuries had worked with it instead of against it. The structure rose in tiers and wings that looked organic from a distance, like something that had grown rather than been built. At night, the bioluminescent plants they cultivated along the terrace walls made the whole silhouette glow in low blues and golds. Kale had seen photographs. The photographs did not do it justice. They arrived at night, through a private landing bay that Saris's aide had cleared with minimal contact. Saris walked beside him through corridors that were both clearly ancient and clearly tended, the stone worn smooth with centuries of use, lit by the same bioluminescent growth as the exterior, which gave everything a quiet, underwater quality of light. She moved through it with the ease of someone in their bones, which was different from the way she'd moved through the marsh. That had been competence and attention. This was home. "You grew up here," he said. "Yes," she glanced at him. "Is it what you expected?" "No," he looked at the stone. "It's older, more alive." "Yes," she seemed pleased by that. "Exactly that." She brought him to a set of guest rooms near the diplomatic wing, small by Citadel standards, which meant spacious by any other standard, with a window that looked out over the pale valley going dark and silver in the moonlight. She told him to rest, that her mother would want to speak with him in the morning. He didn't argue. He stood at the window for a while after she left, watching the valley, and thought about the fact that 48 hours ago he'd been eating a ration bar in a ruined relay station in the Duskmarsh, and now he was looking out a window in a Vel'tharan citadel. And those two things were connected by one person who'd wanted 3 days and a person who'd given them to her. He slept surprisingly well. The Queen was not what he'd expected either. He'd expected ceremony, and there was ceremony. The throne room was exactly as imposing as the photographs. High ceilings of black stone worked with the same bioluminescent cultivation, a floor that had been polished by generations of feet, a throne that was not ornate in the way of human royal furniture, but rather seemed to be an extension of the mountain itself. The Queen sat in it with the complete authority of someone who hadn't needed the object in a long time, but kept it because it was the right vocabulary for the conversations that happened there. Queen Vel'thara was older than her daughter, but with the kind of age that reads as deepened rather than diminished. Her eyes were the same amber, the same precise amber, but cooler, a queen's version of it, banked and measuring. Her skin was the same frost pale with a faint, iridescent quality that Kale had not noticed on Saris but could see now, and realized he'd missed in the diffuse light of the marsh. She wore her silver-white hair in a formal arrangement that told him more about the state of the meeting than anything else in the room. She looked at him for a long time before she spoke. "You found my daughter in the Duskmarsh," she said. Her Vel'tharan was the high dialect, flawless and exact, and she did not offer trade-tongue accommodation. "Yes," he said, "in the high dialect. She found me more accurately. Her beacon was in the range I was surveying." The Queen's eyes moved slightly, an assessment of something. "You did not contact a relay station?" "No." "Why?" It wasn't quite a question. He gave it the answer it deserved. Because she asked for 3 days. Because she'd chosen a silent beacon, which meant she had a reason for quiet. Because I couldn't think of anything she'd done or said that made me think she shouldn't have them. A silence that filled the throne room, the way water fills a vessel. She told me who she was on the 3rd day, he added. She didn't ask me to change anything about what I was doing. I didn't. The Queen looked at him. He looked back. You walked her 40 kilometers across the pale margin, the Queen said. Yes. Carrying 2 packs. She had an immobilized shoulder. Something moved in the Queen's face, small and precise, the way small things moved in Ceres's face, the same lineage of restraint and something warmer underneath it. She told me, she said, the shoulder, the reduction, a pause. She said you explained it before you touched her. I always do, he said. In the field, it makes things go better. The Queen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, why are you still here, Kale Morrow? He blinked. You have a survey contract. You have a grid assignment. You walked her to the relay. She was safe. Her extraction was arranged. You could have gone back to your work. The amber eyes were entirely steady. Why did you come? He thought about it, the honest version. Because she asked me to, he said. And because, I don't know how to explain this well, because it seemed like the thing she needed wasn't just getting home. It was getting home as herself. And I thought maybe, he stopped. This was the edge of territory he hadn't fully mapped. I thought maybe she'd be more herself with someone in the room who knew her as Ceres first. The throne room was very quiet. Knew her as Ceres first, the Queen repeated, very carefully. That's what she called herself, he said. In the marsh. I knew her as Ceres for 3 days before she told me anything else. The Queen was still. The stillness was the kind he recognized now, the Vel'tharan version of something being received, something being put down somewhere inside that didn't let go of things easily. My daughter has lived her entire life as what she is, the Queen said. Crown Princess, future sovereign. The titles exist before the name does in the consciousness of everyone in this court. Everyone in this citadel. A pause. I have tried to give her something other than that. I have not always succeeded. He didn't say anything. She called herself Ceres, the Queen said. Yes. To a stranger in a marsh. To someone who didn't know enough to call her anything else, he said. I didn't know anything else until she decided to tell me. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. You understand that you have put yourself in a complex position, she said, not unkindly. I'm starting to understand that, yes. A human survey scout who sheltered my daughter for 3 days in neutral territory without contact and then accompanied her return. She paused. The outer court will have interpretations. I imagine, he said. I want to know your interpretation, she said. What do you think happened in those 3 days? He thought about it carefully. I think, he said slowly, that a person who needed space to find out who she was got it, and I think I helped make that possible because I had the access and because I chose to. He met the Queen's eyes. I don't think anything else happened, but I think what did happen was real. The silence was long. Yes, the Queen said, I think so too. Part 5. The girl who refused to leave. He was given 3 days at the Citadel while the diplomatic situation, which was apparently what his presence had become, was managed. He was politely and firmly advised to remain in the guest wing, the diplomatic courtyards and the 2 public halls, and to avoid the formal court. He agreed to all of this because it was reasonable, and because in the field you understood the value of knowing which ground was yours. Ceres found him on the first evening. She came to the diplomatic courtyard where he was sitting with a borrowed book, a Vel'tharan survey text, which had turned out to be more interesting than he'd expected, and sat down across from him without ceremony, the way she'd been doing for 3 days in the marsh, and which felt, here in the citadel, like a deliberate choice about register. "How was the conversation?" he said. "Which one?" She sat with the ease of someone who'd made a decision and was done second-guessing it. Her arm was out of the immobilizer. The shoulder was healing well. He could see from the way she moved. "With your mother." "Long." She looked at the courtyard garden. The bioluminescent plants here were cultivated differently than along the walls, with the blue-green glow braided through climbing vines in a pattern he suspected had meanings he wasn't qualified to read. "She asked me many questions. I answered them." A pause. "She asked me about you." "I know, she asked me about myself as well." She looked at him. "What did she ask?" "Why I'm still here," he said. She held very still. "I told her the truth," he said. "Which was?" He looked at her across the courtyard table, in the blue-glow light of the citadel garden, and said, "That you'd ask me to come, and that it seemed important to be in the room as someone who knew you as Saris first." She was quiet for a while. The courtyard made its sounds, wind through the vine growth, something small rustling in the garden's margin, the distant low sound of the citadel living its enormous ancient life around them. "She cried," Saris said. He blinked. "My mother," she looked at the garden. "When I told her about the marsh, about asking for 3 days, about someone who just gave them to me without a price." She paused. "I've never seen her cry before. She would probably not want me to tell you that." "I won't tell anyone," he said. She looked at him. Her amber eyes in the garden light were the color of the heat element in the marsh, warm and deep. "She wants to know if you'll stay," she said. "In the citadel." She's prepared to offer an extended survey consultancy. The Vel'tharan pale margins have been formally surveyed only twice in the last century and both times incompletely. It would be legitimate work, a real contract. She paused. "She also wants," a slight shift in her voice, "she also wants you to stay because I do." He looked at her. "I don't know yet what that means," she said directly, with the honesty of someone who decided in the marsh that she was going to live in the honest register and wasn't going back. "I know that 3 days was real. I know that's something about being known before I was anyone. I know that doesn't happen to me. I know I don't want you to leave." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you that without knowing what you want, because I think that's the true order to say it in." He was quiet for a moment. "In the marsh," he said, "you said you came out there to find out if you existed, apart from everything you were supposed to be." "Yes." "I think," he said, "that the answer was yes. I watched you for 3 days and I saw someone who exists, very clearly." He paused. "I also think I've been walking grids for 8 years, and that's been the right thing to do, but I'm starting to think there might be a ridge I haven't found yet." She tilted her head very slightly, the warm amber eyes. "Your survey ridge," she said. "My ridge," he agreed. A silence that was not empty. "I don't know yet what it means either," he said, "but I'd like to find out." She looked at him for a long moment, and the expression that crossed her face was the one he'd been catching fragments of for 3 days, the younger, truer thing, the unguarded version that didn't come with composed edges. It lasted longer this time. She let it. "All right," she said. Part 6, The Queen's Decision. He expected the next morning to be called back to the throne room. He was not wrong. But the throne room was different in the morning light, or perhaps it was different because the Queen was different. She'd set aside the full state ceremony for something smaller and more considered. 2 seats had been placed near the long window that looked out over the Pale, and a table with tea in the Vel'tharan formal style, which was 3 times as elaborate as human tea service but meant. He understood now, something closer to, "I am treating you as someone who merits care." He sat, she sat. She poured, which was, he would learn later, a significant thing for a sovereign to do in private audience. "My daughter is 23 years in Vel'tharan Count," the Queen said. She looked out the window. In human years approximately the same. She was raised for the throne, entirely, thoroughly, without interruption. There was nothing else on offer. She paused. I believed for a long time that preparing her completely was the most loving thing I could do. He waited. She disagrees, the Queen said, with something wry and painful both. She has been disagreeing very quietly for several years. I didn't hear it until recently, because I was listening for the disagreement I expected, and she was making a different one. She looked at him. And then she went to the Duskmarsh alone with a dislocated shoulder and came home with a survey scout who carries her pack and explains things before he touches them and knew her name before he knew her title. He said nothing. Do you know what she told me that she found in those 3 days? The Queen asked. She told me some of it, he said carefully. She said she found out that she has preferences. The Queen's voice was careful and exact in a way that made him understand how much was being carried in it. Not positions, not diplomatic stances, not choices made within the parameters of what a crown princess is permitted to choose, preferences, the way a person has them. She was quiet for a moment. She said she found that out because you asked her things, small things, camp things, which way to cross a stream, which plants were edible, as though her answer mattered for its own sake and not because of what she was. It did matter, he said. She knew the marsh well. Yes, the Queen looked at him. I know. A pause. I taught her the survival curriculum because I was afraid of this exact kind of situation. I'm grateful I did. I'm also aware that it took a human survey scout with no knowledge of her rank to actually ask her to use it. He thought about that. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. The Queen set down her cup. You gave me my daughter back as herself, not as the crown princess returned from an unauthorized absence. As herself. She paused. I don't know the word for what that is worth. He thought he might not know either. She wants to stay in your orbit, the Queen said. Not romantic, not quite, but not that either. A sovereign's assessment, honest and clear. I have learned in the last day that I cannot give her what you gave her in 3 days by accident. I can try to understand what that means and work with it, or I can try to contain it, and I know enough about my daughter to know what containment costs her. She met his eyes. The consultancy offer is real. The work is real. The contract would be legitimate and well compensated, and you would have standing here. The rest of it, she paused, the rest of it we would need to navigate, carefully, with patience, in whatever direction it goes. He turned it over. That's an honest offer, he said. I try to make honest offers, she said. It serves better in the long run. He thought about his survey grid, 8 years of it, the patient accumulation of mapped terrain. He thought about the ridge. He thought about amber eyes in blue glow light asking him something direct and deserving of a direct answer. I'll need to close out my current contract properly, he said. File the full reports, 2 weeks, maybe 3. The Queen's eyes warmed very slightly, very precisely. Of course. And I'll want to read the terms of the consultancy before I sign anything. Naturally. And I'll want, he stopped. He hadn't entirely decided what came next. I'll want to talk to Saris before I agree to anything, because whatever I agree to, I want her to have agreed to it too, not because it was arranged. The Queen looked at him for a moment that was long and full. Kale Morrow, she said, I think you may be exactly what you appear to be. I try, he said. That, she said, is rarer than you know. Epilogue, what the ridge looked like. He found Saris in the terrace garden, above the diplomatic wing at midday. She was sitting on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, legs crossed, a Vel'tharan field botany text open across her lap that she was clearly not reading. She was looking at the pale valley, wide and silver-gray under the midday overcast, the way the marsh had looked on his first morning there, except that it was enormous and ancient and full of all the things the margin land wasn't. She heard him coming and looked up, and her amber eyes held something that was still figuring itself out, still finding its edges, but there was a steadiness in them that hadn't been there 3 days ago in the ruins. She'd found her ridge. He could see it. He sat down on the wall beside her. "My mother made you an offer," she said. "She did. And I told her I'd talk to you before I decided." She looked at him. The vertical pupils were wide in the overcast light. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He looked at the valley. "I'm doing it because I want to." He turned to face her. "Tell me what you want, not what's been arranged, not what the situation calls for, what you actually want." She was quiet for a moment. Not the careful, armored quiet from the first day in the ruins, a different quiet, the kind that comes before you say something that's actually true. "I want you to stay," she said. "Not because of what you can do for me or what I can offer you. I want you to stay because—" She stopped, started again. "In the marsh I said I hadn't found my ridge, and I haven't, not quite. But I found something." She looked at her hands. "I found what it felt like to be asked a question as though my answer was the only version of the answer there was, not the answer appropriate to my position or the diplomatically sound answer or the answer my mother would want, just mine." She looked up. "I want more of that. I know what that makes me. I know what I'm asking." Her voice was even and steady and open. "But you said tell you what I actually want, and that's it." He held her gaze for a moment. The pale valley stretched enormous and quiet behind her, the light going the particular shade of silver gray that it got before rain. "That's what I wanted to hear," he said. She blinked. "I told your mother I'll file my survey contract close out and come back in 3 weeks. He paused. "I told her I wanted to talk to you first because I didn't want to agree to something you hadn't agreed to. You've just agreed to it." Something shifted in her face, the unguarded version lasting longer, settling in. Not quite a smile, but the place a smile would come from. "You're very methodical," she said. "Survey training," he said. She almost laughed. He heard the shape of it, contained just at the edge of her exhale. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he stood. "I'm going to go file my preliminary survey notes, and then ask your mother's staff if there's anything in the pale margin that genuinely needs mapping. Because I've been looking at the terrain since we landed, and there's a whole ridge system northeast of the second plateau that I bet hasn't been properly logged in 40 years. She looked at him. "I can't just not notice terrain," he said. She did laugh this time, a short, real sound, the first one he'd heard completely. It sounded like the marsh sound she'd almost made over the ration bar, the one she'd caught before it could arrive, except this one got out. "Go file your notes," she said. He went. He was almost to the garden door when she called after him. "Cale." He turned. She was still sitting on the wall, the botany text closed now in her lap, the pale valley behind her under the gray sky, her amber eyes in the overcast light very clear and very steady. 3 days, she said, in the marsh, with no relay report and a second pack. He waited. "Thank you," she said. He thought about the relay station, the heat element, ration bars and a dislocated shoulder, and 3 days of the particular kind of truth-telling that only happens when there's nothing else available. He thought about a person who hadn't known if she existed outside her obligations, and the small moment of certainty he'd watched arrive in her eyes. "You did the hard part," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to the valley, the unguarded expression settling into something quieter and more lasting, the way a fire settles when it no longer needs to prove itself. He went inside. Outside, the pail began to rain. And